Alright, what's going on, guys? One of the main things I've been wanting to talk about for a long time was my opinion on the open world of Elden Ring. As one of the main selling points of Elden Ring's differences to Dark Souls, the open world was something I was dying to explore and find out if they could really nail. And I realized I haven't exactly told you my thoughts about that. So, it was very convenient that I came across this article by PCGamer titled, "After 10 Hours with Elden Ring, I'm Not Sold on the Open World," by Wes Finland. With the subline, Elden Ring's freeform exploration is liberating, but there sure is a lot of empty space. And so I thought, what better way for me to share my thoughts than going through this article with somebody who found it unappealing and breaking it down point by point. But as always, before we get into that, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel is going to be your one-stop shop for all things Elden Ring. But now, let's hear why Elden Ring's open world is bad, according to PCGamer. I began my search for the Elden Ring by running away from a knight on horseback that was 5 times my size. He was resplendent in golden armor, and I had the feeling that my wooden club, rags, and the wagon wheel around my neck wouldn't measure up to the man-sized halberd he was swinging in the air. So I ran, picking up a few berries from bushes along the way and kept walking until I found some enemies that were more my size. Within an hour, I'd gone underground into a small dungeon, killed my first boss, and been granted a spectral steed that could tear across the fields of Elden Ring's open world at a mighty pace. So right off the bat, there's a few points of contention. They just described their first hour in the open world of Elden Ring right after saying the world felt empty. But in their own words, the first hour had a lot of content. They described raiding an enemy camp, encountering a boss they couldn't kill, clearing out a dungeon, and killing their first actual boss. And on top of those things, they still progressed enough to get to the first major plot in the story. And the fact that they couldn't kill the tree sentinel their first try means they have a point of backtracking to come back to at a later time. So in my opinion, that doesn't sound empty at all. That sounds like there was a lot of content in just the first hour. For me, when I started my journey in Elden Ring and I first saw the open world, I was overwhelmed. My immediate thought was that the world looked extremely dense. So right off the bat, we have a disagreement there. But let's move on. The Spectral Steed is important because the impression I got from a weekend of early access to the Elden Ring network test is that I'll be doing a lot of tearing across empty fields in the final game. Gonna have to heavily disagree with that sentence, but let's finish the paragraph at least. Elden Ring's open world is rich with loot and many dungeons to find, but after a decade of exploring From Software's tightly designed kingdoms, it's a shock to see just how spread out everything is in Elden Ring. The network test didn't convince me it was a worthy trade. Okay, first off, there is no trade. All the classic level design we get from past From Software games is still present in Elden Ring. This is a kingdom at war. It wouldn't make sense to have all the castles and bases stacked on top of one another. The whole point of the open world is to give the player that sense of scale and freedom while still maintaining the feeling that they're actually journeying through a new land. That was something that kind of rubbed me the wrong way back in Dark Souls. When I played those games, I really had no sense of the greater world outside of the tight levels I was playing in. And so when I'd hear about all these distant lands in the item descriptions in the lore, it didn't feel plausible that those places actually existed, because all the world-changing events happened in one tiny place. But now with Elden Ring and having that space in between, I now have that sense of a greater world beyond the game. And to the line about the fields being empty, there are no empty fields in this game. You yourself just said they're packed full of loot, world events, and mini dungeons to explore. So please show me this empty field you found, because the entire time I played through the Elden Ring network test, I didn't encounter one. There's a tension at the heart of Elden Ring that From Software's never had to deal with before. As I wrote about in depth in my article on what I liked and didn't like in Elden Ring, it's shaping up to be the most freeform and flexible RPG From's ever made. From the very beginning, you can go off in whatever direction you want, which feels far more freeing than picking one of the 2 or 3 starting paths available from Firelink Shrine as Dark Souls begins. With the steed, you can easily avoid enemies that are too strong for you while you strike out searching for treasure. If you're the type of RPG player who loves coming up with creative builds and optimizing a new run around getting the perfect gear as quickly as possible, Elden Ring holds great promise for you. But I'm worried that freedom means we're going to see a lot less of From Software's traditionally great level design, and that the open world is more filler than new play space. Now, I'm not gonna lie, there were points in the open world that did kind of feel like filler to me, but as I said before, that kind of stuff is necessary to give us a greater scale of the world. And once again, there's no trade-off here. We're still getting all that classic level design in the legacy dungeons. But moving on. When I think about what makes me compelled to explore open world games, a few things come to mind. One is being able to interact with or affect the world in meaningful ways. There will be 100 articles pitting Elden Ring against The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, so I won't linger on on that comparison. The important takeaway is that Breath of the Wild was absorbing because the tools it gave you tied in with systems like gravity and temperature. Stumbling across something mysterious was more often a freeform puzzle to solve than an enemy to fight. FromSoft's games are about combat above all, but they've always been done brilliantly. But it means there's inevitably very little to interact with in the open world. You arrive at the crest of a hill, spend a moment appreciating the view, and then look to see what's in need of a good killing. Now, I can't speak on Breath of the Wild too much, I only played about 30 minutes of that game, but the open world game I did play the most was Skyrim. And I won't lie, they kinda have a point here. Aside from fighting enemies, there really wasn't much to do in the open world, but I don't really think this game needs it. Skyrim, Breath of the Wild, and Elden Ring are all very different games. Skyrim's combat was kinda terrible, so it needed other things to make up for that, like wandering NPCs and a ton of world events. And while those things made me really appreciate the game more, Elden Ring doesn't have those shortcomings. One of its strengths is that it has this sense of isolation. Now, while some added puzzles might be cool, I don't think it's a necessity. We're not really losing anything without them. Quests also pushed me to explore open worlds. In The Witcher 3, I loved seeing where a new bit of story would take me and how a quest about a tragic werewolf stalking a village, or a specter haunting a mansion would enrich my understanding of the game world. Again, Elden Ring deliberately doesn't have those things. Its open world is connective tissue and only engaging when it contains unique things to discover that make it worth slowing down for a moment. I did find some of those things in Elden Ring's open area, like an enormous wagon being hauled by two giants, with chained spears piercing their torsos. He then goes on to describe more about the caravan and the encounter with Agil. Now, his point about the quests in The Witcher 3, it doesn't really hold up because Elden Ring does have quests. They're just different and they don't hold your hand along the way. Now, I do think the open world could benefit from having quests that make you go back to places you've been before, because I felt like extremely in Dark Souls 3 that was one of the shortcomings. For example, after I cleared the Undead Settlement for the first time, I never went back there, and there were a few areas that felt very forgettable and felt like they had little reason to even be in the game. So I think they could be onto something there, but ultimately we're gonna have to wait till the full game comes out to know for sure. Cool discoveries, but all could have worked just as well in a more traditional Souls level. The small dungeons that pockmark the open world are mostly corridors with a few enemies and then a boss. Aside from the bosses, they seem destined to be forgotten, which I wouldn't say about many Souls areas. Even the bad ones are usually memorable. And I'll agree there, the small dungeons were pretty bad. I really hope in the full game we see some more fleshed out ones and that these are only small for the tutorial means. What's impossible to tell from the limited area available in the network test is how well Elden Ring's legacy dungeons will complement the open world sprawl. These are meant to be the dense areas that bring back the intertwining hallways and catacombs FromSoftware has always done well. Only part of one, Stormveil Castle, is explorable in the network test. It looked impressive from the outside, but cut me off too soon to know if it's full of the same satisfying shortcuts and side paths as From's best locations. Given how truly massive the open world in Elden Ring looks to be, I may have only played something like 5% of the full world map. How many legacy dungeons could there be? Enough to feel like truly substantial chunks of the world, or will they just be pit stops along the way? I do, in a sense, understand the concern here, although I think it's vastly misplaced. The little bit we got to play of Stormveil Castle seemed like it's going to be amazing. And comparing it with the gameplay demo that we got to see of even deeper into the level, I think it's clear that it's going to give us exactly what we're looking for. And I don't think we have anything to worry about. Without puzzles or quests, maybe sheer scope and variety and the doomed majesty of FromSoftware's decaying fantasy aesthetic will be enough to make its open world as memorable as Lordran or Yharnam. Maybe there are more small dungeons out there with surprising depth not found in the first area. FromSoftware rarely likes to show off its best material ahead of time. I hope that the key that gives its open world purpose is out there beyond the fog wall somewhere waiting to be discovered. To wrap everything up, I think this point best summarizes why I disagree here. When I think back to Lordran or Lothric, or even Yharnam, I never remember the areas in context of one another. They're always singled out in my memory. And as I said before, the games really don't feel like they belong to a greater world. And so the purpose of Elden Ring's open world is not to be the full game on its own, but to complete it. It's there to give us a context of the greater world, and complete our sense of really being in the lands between. And I think from the little bit that we got to play of that, it did a perfect job. But anyways, that pretty much wraps up the video. What were your thoughts about the open world? Do you think FromSoftware succeeded in what they were aiming for? Or do you think there's something crucial missing from the open world that makes it feel empty without it? Either way, let me know down below and subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll catch you in the next one.